Well, when I think of courage, I can't help but think of action. It's incredibly rare, if ever, that when I think of courage, I think of things like passivity or apathy. Every time I go to think about courage, I see people rushing in and doing something. See, something like enlisting in the armed forces and serving, that sounds courageous and brave to me. Binge watching the TV show Band of Brothers, on the other hand, does not. Something like engaging in a tough conversation you know you need to have, that you summon the courage to act and step into that and actually, carry that out. That sounds courageous to me. Just imagining how that conversation might go and how well you're going to prove all your points, not as courageous. And learning a new skill, maybe reading a book that you know will stretch you or picking up a new language, that is courageous. It's putting yourself out there. It's acting. Adding French for Dummies to your Amazon wish list, on the other hand, not as courageous. See, when I think of courage, I can't help but think of action. They seem unable to be pulled apart, courage and action. And one man, Edmund Burke, once said, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph in this world is that good men and women do nothing." See, action and courage seem to go together, and inaction seems to have nothing to do with courage. It's been a topic that is of interest. What gets people to act courageously that humanity has thought about for a long time? And it begs the question for us, if we were in a situation that demanded courage, if we were part of a perilous situation or emergency took place near us, would we be able to step up and act? It's just a fundamentally human question. What will we do in those sorts of situations? Now, many people, great authors, the canon of literature and our history have written about this, and we know that it's really risen to the level of human priority when they start making TV shows about it. And in 2008 on ABC, they aired a show called What Would You Do? And they created everyday situations, and they watched how people would respond. Would they step up and act courageously? They would stage things like kids vandalizing a car and see what passersby would do. Would they intervene and stop or just pass on by? They'd have people getting pickpocketed. There'd be one person, the person behind would pickpocket, and they'd see what the person 3 people deep would be doing. Now, some of the critiques of it were, these aren't necessarily everyday situations. Do we ever see them happening? But lots of situations that require courage and action happen all the time. I was talking with Mark about this early in the week, and he said, "Man, do I have a story for you." He and Joe English, another guy in our congregation, went out for coffee earlier in the week, and Mark had the courage to order a caramel macchiato, and he didn't even know what a macchiato was. And he didn't even get whipped cream on it. No, I'm just kidding. They were sitting having coffee, and as they were talking, Mark and Joe witnessed a car accident in which one of the cars flipped over. And as they witnessed it, they both had the same impression, that it looked like the driver of the vehicle was ejected, and they thought this could be very bad. So they saw this emergency happen, and Mark said, as we took about a second, and it took Joe only that second to stand up and start rushing towards the danger. And he got there, he was the first responder, the driver ended up being okay, but there's a situation that required courageous action in an emergency, and they rose to the occasion. Other events, when I ask about this, I keep hearing stories about people, even just in our congregation, pulling people from burning cars. People are acting courageously all the time. One young man acted courageously as well. You can put his picture up there. This is a little 8-year-old named Lin Hao. He, in 2008, was sitting in his 2nd grade schoolhouse building in the Sichuan province of China when a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck. It would end up killing 70,000 people in the region that it damaged. The earthquake collapsed Lin's school in on him and his classmates. He was fortunate enough to be able to crawl free from the rubble, and when he emerged on the other side, he said, "I don't see all my classmates here with me." So he crawled back in. As he did get, you can see some of the scratches on his face. He was injured in his hands and his face. Some rubble fell on him, but he was able to pull out 2 unconscious classmates and drag them to safety. Out of the 32 people in his second grade classroom that morning, only 10 survived that day. And as Lynn dragged them out to safety and waited for emergency responders to show up on the scene, he led them in their school song, and he said he wanted to keep their spirits high as they waited for help. And obviously this garnered some attention, and they asked Lynn, they said, why? What made you go back in to that perilous situation? And he said, well, that was the day that I was the hall monitor, and I was responsible for the safety of my classmates. See, people do step up and act courageously. The Chinese government recognized him. He actually got to walk in the opening ceremonies of the Olympics back in 2008. But for every Mark Bolton and Joe English and Lynn Howe, tons of situations happen where many people don't step up and act. In the late 60s, Eleanor Bradney, she was an American supermodel, and she was shopping on Fifth Avenue, and she fell and actually fractured her leg. And for 40 minutes, people just parted around her and walked on by as she asked for help. And after about 40 minutes, one cab driver realized what was going on and stopped and drove her to a hospital. Also in New York, a young man named Andrew Mormill, he was 17 years old. He was on the A train heading home into Manhattan, and he was jumped and stabbed in the stomach. As his assailant left, 11 people sat on his bus car and observed him bleeding, and it eventually led to his death in front of 11 bystanders. And maybe most famously, in New York, Kitty Genovese was attacked in front of a big apartment complex. About 36 people reported seeing what was happening, and none of them called the police to get her help. This is what is called the bystander effect. It corrects our assumption that, man, if somebody is in need, people step up and help. And what it says is actually when lots of people witness an emergency, everybody assumes somebody else is on it. Everybody assumes if lots of people witness a person get hurt or a need come to the surface, if there's lots of people, everybody assumes their neighbor is going to step up and handle it. And researchers have done study after study to try to confirm this reality about human nature, that when a group of us see a need, we often don't act. It's called the bystander effect. I'm going to show a video in just a few seconds that has this mock scenario. They have people going into a room and filling out a questionnaire. And as they're filling out the questionnaire, they start pumping smoke into the room, which sets off the smoke alarm, and they observe what people do. It seems to be, an emergent situation. And obviously, I've kind of tipped my hand a little bit. If it's the bystander effect and people act slower or don't act when there's a group, you obviously can imagine that when they ran this with individuals, people got up and reacted quite quickly. And in fact, most individuals within about 5 seconds were responding to the emergency. They were saying like something's wrong, they were going over and inspecting where the smoke was coming from, and they got themselves out of there. But they also ran the experiment with groups of people in the room. Now, if it took individuals 5 seconds to respond, what do you think? How long did it take groups to respond? Any guesses? 10 seconds? It's a great guess. Any others? Well, let's take a look at this video and find out how long it took. Now, there's some really helpful color commentary by the psychologist running it. His job seems to be just pointing out the obvious. So he's my favorite character in it. But let's take a look and find out how long it took groups of people to react to an emergency.
She's now noticed the smoke and is concerned. At this point, she decides to investigate to find out what's going on. She's immediately taken responsibility for figuring out what to do.
Mary does the sensible thing and evacuates quickly. She even leaves her bag and coat. But Mary was on her own. This time, we've planted 7 actors who are all in on the experiment. We've said to them, when you see the smoke, do nothing. Our second participant is Lauren Heffernan, also a student. What will she do? Now, how long before she dashes out of the room?
She's checking increasingly to see what the other people are thinking. But who can she appeal to? The answer is nobody. She turns to the norm of the group: ignore the smoke. In a real fire, the people in this group would be in very serious danger by now. She's waiting for someone else to react. Why isn't anyone else reacting? She feels uncomfortable. She doesn't want to embarrass herself by taking the lead, taking action. But something is definitely wrong.
Lauren stayed in the room for 20 minutes after spotting the smoke, concerned but immobile. In the end, we had to ask her to leave.
What about him? Thanks.
I was surprised that I didn't do anything at all. I was just literally waiting. I just thought that someone else is surely going to say something soon. And because no one else did, I just didn't react at all.
We tried the experiment 10 times, and the same thing happened over and over again. If the person was on their own, they left quickly. If they were in a group of 3 or more, they stayed, rooted to the spot. The average length of time they stayed, 13 minutes.
Pretty surprising. When a group of people saw an emergency, no one reacted. I love the commentary, right? They said, Mary does the sensible thing and leaves. Lauren, on the other hand, was concerned but immobile. She was surprised by her own inaction. She was waiting for someone else to confirm what she knew, that it was an emergency. But she couldn't summon the courage to step up and act. See, this is incredible. When you're alone, problems seem a little more obvious. But when multiple people see a problem, everybody is looking for cues, the other people. The problem is, everybody is looking for other cues. So nobody is willing to step up and act. Even when, if you read the paper, it even says, even as smoke is obscuring the view of their questionnaire, most people would just sit there. And then they finally actually had to ask Lauren to leave the room, which you could see was kind of a relief to her, oh, yeah, get me out of here. This is the bystander effect. This morning, we're going to look at the story of Nehemiah, and we're going to see how he sidestepped this bystander effect. He saw a problem that lots of people saw, but something was different about the way he reacted. He didn't assume that someone else would handle it. He didn't assume just because lots of people saw the problem that he was off the hook. He stepped up and acted courageously into an opportunity that God was giving him. So we're not going to be able to look at the entire story of Nehemiah, but we will look at this part where he sidesteps the bystander effect. But to get ready for that, we need to know a thing or two about 2 things. We need to know about the temple, and we need to know about the exile of the Jews. See, these are 2 incredible elements in the background story that if we're not up to speed with how significant they were, we will miss out. So we need to know about the temple, and we need to know about the exile. Well, first let's talk a little bit about the temple. The first is the temple was the centerpiece of Jewish religious life. After they had sort of moved into Jerusalem, God saw fit for them to create a temple in which to worship him. In 1 Kings 6, it records this. It says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is a great time of the year, I think, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Now, this temple would become hugely symbolic for the religious life and, in fact, the whole life of the people of Israel. It would be where God's presence dwelt. In the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was God's concentrated, unfettered Shekinah glory. It was a place that was so saturated with God's presence, they only allowed for one person to go in once a year on the great day of atonement. This was the place where God had taken up residence and his presence dwelt here on earth. But it wasn't just significant for that. It was also significant because this is where Israel would come and offer their sacrifices to worship and atone for their sin. See, this was where God said, you can meet with me. There were all sorts of offerings that they could offer unto God. Some were voluntary, some were mandatory. Some were just saying, thank you, God. Others were saying, I'm sorry, God. This was the place not just where God's presence dwelt, but where they came to offer these sacrifices. And the whole temple itself just screamed of God's purity and holiness. Some of the offerings that they could offer, there were burnt offerings and grain offerings of food. There were peace offerings. And finally, there were sin and trespass offerings. And this is where God allowed for Israel to come to atone for their sin. Now, it's so easy, in light of the work of Jesus Christ, for us to look back at this list of sacrifices that they were required to make time and time again and see it as just this long list of regulations that were heaped on the backs of these poor people, that they were misguided in what they were doing. The interesting thing, I think, is if you imagine being a Jew in that time, if you can imagine being a slave in Egypt and crying out to God and being rescued, and then after God's good and gracious work and rescuing you out of this oppression, you and your people consistently strayed from God, time and time again, neglected to keep God's commands, neglected to keep your heart warm towards God's love, and just time and time again kept going astray. You could imagine if that was your story and God said, hey, but there's a way that you can still be near me. You can come to the temple and offer sacrifices, and that will atone for your sin, and you can keep your fellowship going with me. Yes, it might have been a long list of regulations, but I think to many of the Jews, they would have said, this is our chance to be near God. The temple was the center of all of this activity, God's presence, God's character, and the atonement of sin. And yet in 586, that temple was destroyed. In 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came in and he sacked Jerusalem, and by 586 he had destroyed the temple. And not only that, but once he had destroyed the temple, he exiled the people forcibly. He began to deport some of the higher classes of the Jewish people and force them into a foreign land, the land of Babylon. This exile was predicted by Jeremiah not too long before it happened. In the 25th chapter of the book, the prophetic work of Jeremiah, they talk about all the ways that the people of Israel have gone astray and they should have been keeping the law. And it says, but in verse 7, but you did not listen to me. And then we'll pick it up in verse 8. It says, therefore the Lord Almighty says, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now this again is one of those things that ought to make our jaws drop. And if you were a Jew in that time, your mouth would have been agape. God says, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. This would not have been on your top 10 list of godly people to aspire to be like. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of a pagan nation. And God says, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, and I'll bring him against this land and its inhabitants. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland. These nations will serve that king of Babylon for 70 years. This would have been utterly disorienting for the people of Israel. Their temple would have been destroyed. Their place where they could access God, where they could atone for sin, where they could be near to him, was destroyed. And the land that God had given them to inhabit, they were kicked out of. We have to imagine the thoughts they might have been thinking about God, saying, God, what are you doing? Are you really still in charge? Are you keeping your covenant that you made with us? Now, all along, Israel had been breaking the covenant, but God's a man of his word, and he promised to upkeep his end of the bargain. But it certainly didn't feel like that was happening as they were kicked out of their land, watching the ruins of the temple in the distance. And yet, even though they were so disoriented, any way you look at it, religiously, politically, psychologically, economically, the people of Israel would have been completely disoriented. And even despite all this perilous situation they were in, this foreign land in Babylon under a pagan king, God had high hopes and high aspirations for how they might be a people in exile. And again, talking about this exile is so important. We talk so much about the exodus from Egypt. I find sometimes, though, I think less and we talk less about the exile when God's people were inhabiting the land that they were promised and then they were kicked out by a foreign king. And yet, despite all this disorientation, God had high expectations. He said, I don't want you to just be, kicking the dirt and being curmudgeonly all the time while you're in exile. I want to grow you into the people I know you can be. I actually want you to serve these foreign peoples and this foreign king in this foreign land while you're in exile and your temple is destroyed. I want to grow you during this difficult time. Certainly sounds like something God would do, doesn't it? And so during it in Jeremiah 29, he sort of laid out how they are supposed to be a people in exile. It says this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those, and this is God speaking, I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. It's not as if God is saying like, oh, I can't believe this. Nebuchadnezzar sort of, pulled a fast one on me. He's saying, no, I'm in charge. I'm at the helm. I am the God of history. I let you be exiled from Jerusalem into Babylon. And he says, and while you're there, licking your wounds, being completely disoriented, maybe even questioning my character, you know what I want you to do? Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. God is saying, I know you're in a tough spot, but I am going to do something great in the most unlikely of circumstances. While the temple is destroyed and you're kicked out of your land, exiled in Babylon, I want to grow you in the kind of people that serve and pray for their enemies. This is the kind of glorious, wonderful, impossible work that God is calling his people to. He's saying, though the world looks like it's against you, serve it and pray for it. I mentioned all that background about the temple and the exile, and that God is the chief actor among all those events, because it helps us see where Nehemiah is in the story when it begins. See, what has happened is, after those years, way after the exile ended, there was an edict made by King Cyrus that Israel could come back in. They've started to rebuild the temple, and they actually rededicate it in 516 BC. And by the time it got to Nehemiah, these are all the events that have happened. The people Israel inhabited their land, built a temple, their land was sacked, the temple was destroyed, and they were exiled. And by the time Nehemiah comes on the scene, the people were invited back in, the temple was rebuilt, but all of the work wasn't yet finished. And that's where we pick up the story of Nehemiah and where we see him being a courageous person of action. We'll pick it up in the first chapter of Nehemiah in verse 2. It says, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So he's asking about both his people and his city. Goes on, it says, they said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province, and who are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. For some days I mourned and I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah, we find out a little later, had a very prominent position of power in the court of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was the king after Xerxes. Have you ever seen, some recent movies like 300 where they have he's like the bald, weird-looking king? This is his kid, Artaxerxes. And Nehemiah is serving in Artaxerxes' court. And he had become the cupbearer to the king. It tells us that later on in the chapter. Now, the cupbearer had direct access to the king. He was kind of like the wine selector, that he would pick the right wines for the meals that the king would eat. But he'd also taste test them to make sure that nobody had poisoned the wine. So he was in the line of fire all the time, but he was also constantly around this megalomaniac king, Artaxerxes. And he was always trying to be, Artaxerxes would invite him in, but Artaxerxes, like many of the kings that time, sometimes acted rashly. So Nehemiah was in this significant position of power, but kind of living a precarious existence. And all the while, he was a Jew. His people had been exiled long ago when Nebuchadnezzar sacked the city and destroyed the temple and kicked them out. And his people, for generations, had built a life in that exile time, maybe so obediently that they had risen to a position of prominence. I mention that because when Nehemiah would go to rally some support for the cause that God was calling him to, he would be going as an ally to the pagan king. This is just another story of God doing something incredible through an unlikely source. Isn't that the way that God does so much of what he does? He mobilizes under-resourced and underqualified people to do things that will last in eternity. In the background, the city of Jerusalem that Nehemiah would travel back to, the temple was rebuilt by people that had been kicked out for 70 years. For 2 generations, maybe 3 generations. They had been on the underside of power, and yet they mounted a force to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so, Nehemiah was a prominent person in the court of Artaxerxes. And coincidentally, but again, it's not really a coincidence when God's involved, one of his brothers comes in and he says, "Hey, how's the city? How are my people?" And the report is pretty grim. As for Nehemiah's people, they were in trouble and in disgrace and shame. And as for his city, the temple may have been rebuilt, but the walls around it were still broken down. Since the time of Nebuchadnezzar, 140 years before, they had never quite finished rebuilding the walls, and the gates were still lying in ruins. There were a few efforts to try to rebuild the walls around the great city, and yet they all failed. That city and those people were sitting ducks for whoever decided they want to overtake them. And Nehemiah hears this and is moved. This is an incredible scene in the scriptures where we get to watch a person get their call from God to do something, where how they're uniquely made, their heart and their gifts and their passions come together and meet the world in one of its places of pain. This scene sends chills down my spine because we are watching Nehemiah get spoken to by the God of the universe. This is the thing that Nehemiah was going to put his life behind. This was the place where Nehemiah, in every way that God had made him, his special giftings meets the pain of the world. This is God mobilizing someone. This is God giving them a call. And what's the secret behind Nehemiah's action? As soon as he hears this, he becomes engaged. And I think Nehemiah allowed God to answer this question for him. It's as if somebody was asking Nehemiah, "What's your problem?" Now, God could have been asking it like, "What's your problem?" Right? But he also was just saying, "No, Nehemiah, what's your problem? What's the thing that you are going to fix in this world? Where am I working that you want to join in with me? Nehemiah, what's your problem?" And so when a problem came by that fit Nehemiah's passions and skill set and his priorities, it was as if God was dropping a heaven-sent problem in his lap. Could you imagine seeing a problem that big as a gift from God? He was moved and saddened, and yet he said, "This is my problem." Now, this problem certainly didn't lack in numbers of people that have seen it. In fact, I think it might have been one of those problems that has fallen prey to the bystander effect. So many people, for so long, were so aware that the wall around Jerusalem was broken and burnt. And for generations, people had said, somebody else must be on that. It's like being in that smoking room with lots of other people saying, nobody else is moving, so this must not be an emergency. And yet something is different for Nehemiah. He hears about this problem, and he falls to his knees, and he fasts and prays and mourns and says, this isn't just some problem. This is my problem. He made it his problem, and it sprung to action. He didn't imagine, hey, there must be so many other people that know about this. I think I'm good here in the court of Artaxerxes. I've risen to a place of prominence. I hear problems all the time. People bring them to Artaxerxes and say, oh, can you help me with this thing? There's tons of problems I could latch onto. This one must be just one of the many that I hear all the time. Nehemiah had scores of reasons to fall prey to the bystander effect, but he imagined that God was speaking this problem to him. This was a heaven-sent problem that dropped in Nehemiah's lap. This was a huge problem, but Nehemiah said, this isn't just some problem out there for somebody else to solve. I'm going to make this my problem. Tons of people knew about it. Only Nehemiah stepped up and acted. So Nehemiah, we see, has the courage to act. It's a courage that we all need. See, what Nehemiah did is he notices what's going on around him. He defines the situation as a problem. It raised it to that level of significance for him. And then he said, even though it's a problem out there, I'm going to own it. I'm going to take responsibility. And then he starts to act. He says, this isn't just some problem, this is my problem. We face this opportunity every single day. Problems come across our desks, across our paths, across our homes all the time. But we need to be aware that sometimes when lots of people see that problem, or even if we imagine lots of people have seen this problem, that we get sucked into the bystander effect and say somebody else must have it. This can happen with big problems, even clean drinking water and toilet facilities to the millions and billions of people in the world that lack them. Right? The issues of human trafficking, on the order of 30 million trafficked and enslaved people in the world. Those problems are just gigantic that come across our field of view all the time. Lots of people know about those. Somebody else must be handling them. But these problems don't have to be that big and that out there for us to fall prey to the bystander effect. They can be within the four walls of your home right now. It might be thinking about your future. You're not really sure where you're headed. Maybe you're a young adult trying to figure all this out. And you haven't quite planned out exactly where you're going to be headed. But lots of people know about your situation. Somebody else might be on that, helping solve that for you. You might be trying to pick a mate or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That might be a problem that you say, like, I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to anybody. I'm not even sure what I'm doing. Maybe that's just some problem out there, and I'm just going to keep going with the flow. You might have your own family, and one of your kids is going off the rails. But lots of people see that. Your spouse sees it. Friends and family see it. Somebody else might get that. It might even be within your marriage. It might be growing a little cooler and more distant between you and your spouse. But the other person will probably handle that. See, I think it's so easy to fall prey to the bystander effect with problems that really matter, that need our attention, but we need the courage to act. Because it's sometimes intimidating to own a problem. Because we have to admit there is a problem. And I think from the story of Nehemiah, we can learn to step on the other side of this bystander effect and say, no, if I see a problem, I'm going to say, that's my problem. That's not just somebody else's problem. I'm going to take ownership. I may not have a plan yet, but God will give me one. And we also learn that from Nehemiah, because you know what happens is Nehemiah has the courage to act, but he secondly has the courage to ask. The first thing he does is fall on his knees and pray to God. His prayer goes like this. Picks up in verse 5. He says, then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. He's calling God and addressing him by his special name, Yahweh. He's self-identifying as part of the people Israel. Even though he's in the court of Artaxerxes, he's saying, Yahweh is my God. He's saying, Yahweh, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Goes on in verse 6. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear. The prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people Israel. I confess the sins of we Israelites. He isn't just saying some other people are sinning. He's saying, we are culpable, Lord. We sin, including, and he includes himself and his father's family, and have committed these sins against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. He goes on, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are faithful, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name. They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed By your great strength and your mighty hand, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, for I was cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah sees a problem. He says, that's my problem. And the first thing he does is say, whoa, this is a big problem. I'm going to need to ask for some help. And so he goes to God and praises God for his great and mighty works. He praises God for all the promises he makes. He praises God for even having standards, saying if we go wayward, it is right for you to exile us. And yet he calls on the beautiful grace of God, who says, even if you're exiled people at the farthest horizon, Lord, you can gather them back together. And Nehemiah is saying, and I want in. This seemingly impossible work that only you can do, I went in on the ground floor. I want to be a part of it. I know I'm biting off more than I can chew, Lord, but please, I'm asking for help. Nehemiah had the courage to act, but he also had the courage to ask. Maybe you know of a problem out there. Maybe it's way out there. Maybe it's right inside the four walls of your house. Maybe there's a problem that you need to say, that's not just some problem. That's my problem. And you need to get the courage from God to act and then to ask God for help. Maybe you need to say, that's my problem, to something right underneath your nose. And maybe you've already identified the problem, but you haven't asked for help yet. Maybe you need to pray to God to say, who do I need to rally around this cause to help me? And maybe you're the problem. Maybe you have something that seems insurmountable in your own life. And it's easy to just not own it. Because then you'd have to admit you got a problem. Maybe you are the problem, and you just need to ask someone for help. Wouldn't it be beautiful if we could be the kind of church that could respond to those kinds of cries? To say, I'm in over my head, I'm dealing with this situation that I don't know how to handle. I think my marriage is falling apart, and my kids, I don't know how to handle them. I don't know what career to choose. I don't know what I'm doing with my life. Wouldn't it be beautiful if this was the kind of church where we could bring those asks and say, I'm here with you. And let's ask God together for help. That would be the kind of courage I long to see in my own life, the lives of my friends and family, and the life of this church. And in so many ways, we are getting this right. There's always room for improvement. That we can look out in the world and see needs, see great emergencies that we need to notice and call emergencies and then own and then act. And we need to ask God for his size help. See, that's the beautiful promise of the gospel. It's the beautiful promise of our God. In the book of Joel, it says, and everyone who calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. In the book of Matthew, it says, ask and it will be given to you. See, our great God says, ask, please ask. I am ready and willing and able to help. And the only reason we have that blessing, that privilege, that awesome responsibility to be asking God for help with God-sized problems in this world is because there was one who exemplified courage, who saw an insurmountable problem, a wayward human race that needed rescued and saving. And he acted. And in the moment of his highest need, he said, God, you got to help me out with this one. Maybe you could do it and I could get out of this. And God said to his son, no, you got to do this. See, God knew that sin was separating us from him. He knew that it didn't matter if the temple was up or down, that our sin kept us apart from him. And he needed to say no to one guy to pay for sin so that when we ask, he can say yes. Jesus closed that gap. He tightened that distance between us and God because he took the no and kept going anyways so that we can ask and receive. We can call on the name of the Lord and he will save us. All because Jesus, on our behalf, on your behalf, said, this is my problem. I can solve it. It's going to cost me everything, but I'll do it. So that we, on the other side of that great sacrifice, can hear God's yes. When we cry out to him, he says, I'm there for you. I don't need to stay distant. I don't need to stay far away. I can rush in and help. See, we can learn from the story of Nehemiah to have the courage to act and the courage to ask. And to say, that's not just a problem. That's my problem. Let's pray.